In the frozen forests of Finland, where temperatures drop to 40 degrees below zero and the sun barely rises above the horizon, death moved silently through the snow. It wore no uniform, carried no banner, and left no trace except for the bodies it left behind. The Soviet Union called it the White Death. The Finnish people called it their guardian angel. But this legendary figure was not what anyone expected. She was barely 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds, and had never fired a rifle in anger before the war began. Yet in just 100 days, she would become the most feared sniper in military history, changing the course of a war that was supposed to last only weeks. Her story is not just about incredible marksmanship or military strategy. It's about how an ordinary person can become extraordinary when everything they love is threatened. This is the true story of how one woman's determination to protect her homeland turned her into a legend that would inspire generations and strike fear into the hearts of an entire army. Her name would become whispered in awe and terror across battlefields, and her legacy would prove that heroes come in the most unexpected forms. Simo Häyhä was born in the small farming village of Rotjärvi, Finland, in 1905. She grew up in a world where survival depended on understanding the land, the weather, and the animals that moved through the endless forests. Her father taught her to hunt from a young age, not as a sport, but as a necessity. In rural Finland, hunting meant the difference between having meat on the table during the brutal winters and going hungry. From the time she could hold a rifle, Simo showed an unusual talent for marksmanship. While other children played games, she practiced shooting at targets her father set up behind their small wooden house. She learned to control her breathing, to feel the rhythm of her heartbeat, and to squeeze the trigger between beats when her body was perfectly still. Her father noticed something special about his daughter's shooting. She never seemed nervous, never rushed her shots, and rarely missed. The forests around Rotjärvi became her classroom. Simo learned to move silently through the woods, to read animal tracks in the snow, and to remain perfectly motionless for hours while waiting for the right moment to take a shot. She understood how sound traveled through the cold air, how the wind affected a bullet's path, and how to use the natural landscape to remain hidden. These skills, learned during peaceful hunting trips, would later save her life and the lives of countless Finnish soldiers. As Simo grew into a young woman, she became known throughout the region as one of the finest marksmen anyone had ever seen. Local hunting competitions became routine victories for her. She could hit targets that other experienced hunters couldn't even see clearly. But, more importantly, she developed a deep love for her homeland. The forests, lakes, and small communities of Finland were not just her home, they were part of her identity. Life in Finland during the 1930s was simple but harsh. The country had only recently gained independence from Russia in 1917, and many Finnish people still remembered what it felt like to live under foreign rule. They valued their freedom and were determined to protect it. Simo lived a quiet life, working on her family's farm, helping with the harvest, and spending her free time in the forests she loved so much. She never imagined that her peaceful world was about to change forever. On November 30, 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Finland. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, believed that conquering Finland would be easy. The Soviet army had nearly 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. Finland had only 300,000 soldiers and very little modern equipment. Stalin expected the war to last no more than a few weeks. He was catastrophically wrong. The conflict became known as the Winter War, and it would test every Finnish citizen's courage and determination. When the invasion began, Simo was 34 years old and had never been a soldier. But, like many Finns, she immediately volunteered to defend her country. The Finnish military was desperate for anyone who could shoot accurately, and Simo's reputation as a marksman had spread beyond her small village. She was assigned to the 6th Company of JR 34, a Finnish infantry regiment tasked with defending the Kala River area. This region was considered one of the most important defensive positions in Finland. If the Soviets could break through at Kala, they would have a clear path to cut Finland in half. The responsibility was enormous, and the odds seemed impossible. When Simo arrived at the front lines, many of the male soldiers were skeptical about having a woman in combat. War was considered a man's job, and some questioned whether she would be able to handle the physical and emotional demands of battle. These doubts disappeared quickly once the fighting began and Simo's extraordinary abilities became apparent. The Finnish strategy was based on necessity rather than choice. They couldn't match the Soviet Union's numbers or firepower, so they had to be smarter, faster, and more efficient. Finnish soldiers used guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and, then, disappearing into the forests before the enemy could respond. Snipers played a crucial role in this strategy. A single well-placed shot could eliminate an enemy officer, disrupt attack plans, and create fear among enemy soldiers. Simo's first confirmed kill came during her third day at the front. Soviet soldiers were advancing through a snow-covered field, confident that their overwhelming numbers would easily overwhelm the Finnish defenders. Simo positioned herself behind a fallen log, covered herself with a white sheet to blend into the snow, and waited. Through her rifle scope, she could see a Soviet officer directing his men forward. She controlled her breathing, aimed carefully, and fired a single shot. The officer fell, and the entire Soviet advance ground to a halt as soldiers looked for the hidden sniper who had killed their leader. What made Simo different from other snipers was not just her accuracy, but her patience and intelligence. She studied enemy patterns, learned their routines, and positioned herself where she could do the most damage. She never fired unless she was certain of a hit, and she never stayed in the same position long enough to be discovered. After each shot, she would crawl through the snow to a new location, sometimes moving hundreds of meters while remaining completely invisible. The weapon Simo used was a standard Finnish rifle called the Seiko M/28-30. It was not a sophisticated sniper rifle with a high-powered scope. Instead, it was a simple, reliable hunting rifle that she had modified for her own use. She preferred iron sights over a scope because scopes could fog up in the extreme cold and reflected sunlight, potentially giving away her position. Her intimate knowledge of this rifle, combined with her natural shooting ability, made her incredibly deadly. As weeks passed, Simo's reputation grew among both Finnish and Soviet forces. Finnish soldiers began to hear stories about the mysterious sniper who could appear anywhere and disappear just as quickly. Soviet soldiers started to fear moving through certain areas, knowing that death could come from any direction without warning. Military commanders on both sides began to take notice of this unusual soldier who was having such a significant impact on the war. The psychological effect of Simo's presence on the battlefield was as important as the actual casualties she inflicted. Soviet soldiers became nervous and hesitant, constantly looking over their shoulders and jumping at every sound. This fear made them less effective in combat and gave Finnish forces a crucial advantage. One person was creating doubt and terror among thousands of enemy soldiers. Simo's daily routine during the war was exhausting and dangerous. She would wake before dawn, eat a small meal, and, then, make her way to her chosen position for the day. She carried minimal equipment, her rifle, ammunition, water, and a few pieces of bread or dried meat. Everything else was unnecessary weight that could slow her down or make noise at a crucial moment. Finding the right position was an art that Simo had perfected. She looked for locations that provided good visibility of enemy movement, multiple escape routes, and natural camouflage. She preferred positions where she could use the terrain to muffle the sound of her rifle and confuse enemies about where the shots were coming from. Sometimes she would spend hours crawling through snow and ice to reach the perfect spot. Once in position, Simo could remain motionless for 8 to 10 hours, waiting for the right targets. She learned to ignore hunger, cold, and discomfort, focusing entirely on the area she was watching. Her ability to remain patient and alert for such long periods was extraordinary, even by military standards. She understood that impatience led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. The targets Simo chose were always strategic. She prioritized enemy officers, communications personnel, and machine gun operators. By eliminating these key figures, she could disrupt entire enemy operations. A single shot could prevent an attack, save dozens of Finnish lives, and buy precious time for defensive preparations. Every bullet had to count because ammunition was limited and every shot risked revealing her position. As December 1939 turned into January 1940, Simo's kill count continued to rise at an alarming rate. Military records show that she was averaging more than 5 confirmed kills per day, a rate that was unprecedented in military history. These numbers represented not just exceptional marksmanship, but careful planning, incredible endurance, and absolute dedication to protecting her homeland. The international press began to take notice of the Winter War and the remarkable stories emerging from the conflict. Reports of an extraordinary Finnish sniper started to appear in newspapers around the world. However, most of these reports incorrectly assumed that such an effective soldier must be a man. The idea that a small woman from a farming village could become the most feared sniper in the world seemed impossible to many people. Soviet military leaders were becoming increasingly frustrated with their inability to locate and eliminate this mysterious sniper. They assigned special counter-sniper teams specifically to hunt Simo down, but she always seemed to stay one step ahead of them. Her intimate knowledge of the local terrain gave her an enormous advantage over Soviet soldiers who were unfamiliar with the Finnish wilderness. The harsh winter conditions that made life miserable for everyone actually worked in Simo's favor. She had grown up in this climate and understood how to survive and function in extreme cold. Soviet soldiers, many of whom came from warmer regions of the Soviet Union, struggled with the brutal Finnish winter. They moved more slowly, made more noise, and were less alert due to the constant battle against freezing temperatures. By January 1940, the name White Death had spread throughout the Soviet army like a terrifying legend. Soldiers whispered stories about an invisible killer who could strike from impossible distances and vanish without a trace. Soviet commanders issued special orders about the mysterious sniper, offering substantial rewards for any information that could lead to her capture or elimination. What they didn't realize was that their enemy was a quiet woman who returned to a simple dugout each night and wrote letters to her family between battles. The psychological warfare that Simo's presence created was becoming as valuable as her actual kills. Entire Soviet units would refuse to advance through areas where she had been active. Soldiers would freeze in terror at the slightest sound, convinced that the White Death was watching them through a rifle scope. This fear allowed smaller Finnish forces to hold positions that should have been impossible to defend against the much larger Soviet army. Simo's tactics evolved as the war progressed. She began using decoy positions, leaving equipment in obvious sniper locations to draw enemy fire while she operated from completely different areas. She created false snow disturbances to make Soviet soldiers believe she was in multiple places at once. Her understanding of human psychology made her as dangerous as her marksmanship skills. One of her most famous engagements occurred during a major Soviet assault on Finnish positions near the Kala River. Soviet forces had concentrated nearly 4,000 soldiers for what they believed would be a decisive breakthrough. Intelligence reports indicated that they planned to overwhelm Finnish defenses through sheer numbers and, then, push deep into Finnish territory. Simo positioned herself on a small hill overlooking the main approach route the Soviets would have to use. She had studied this area for weeks, identifying the best positions for different wind conditions and times of day. She knew every tree, rock, and depression in the landscape. More importantly, she had prepared multiple firing positions and escape routes in case the Soviets discovered her location. The assault began at dawn with a massive artillery bombardment intended to destroy Finnish defensive positions. Simo remained hidden in a specially constructed snow cave, waiting for the barrage to end and the infantry attack to begin. The sound of exploding shells was deafening, and the ground shook continuously, but she remained calm and focused on her mission. When the artillery stopped, Soviet soldiers began advancing across the open ground in waves. From her concealed position, Simo could see hundreds of men moving toward finish lines. She waited patiently for the right moment, knowing that her first shot would reveal her position and begin a deadly game of hide and seek. Her first target was a Soviet colonel who was directing the attack from a prominent position. Through her iron sights, she could see him clearly, pointing and shouting orders to his men. Simo controlled her breathing, aimed carefully, and fired. The colonel fell immediately, and the organized attack began to lose coordination as soldiers looked around frantically for their fallen leader. What happened next became legendary among Finnish forces. Instead of retreating or changing positions after her first shot, Simo remained in place and continued firing. She had identified multiple high-value targets and realized that this might be her best opportunity to severely disrupt the Soviet attack. Over the next 20 minutes, she fired 19 shots and scored 19 kills, eliminating key officers and communications personnel. Each shot was precisely calculated. Simo would identify a target, wait for the perfect moment when wind conditions and the target's position were optimal, and then fire a single, lethal shot. She never hurried, never wasted ammunition, and never missed. The systematic elimination of their leadership threw the Soviet attack into complete chaos. Soviet soldiers began firing wildly in all directions, trying to locate the sniper who was picking off their officers. Artillery was called in to blast the area where they thought she might be hiding, but Simo had already moved to a different position. By the time the bombardment ended, she was nearly 300 meters from her original location, completely invisible in the snow-covered landscape. The psychological impact of this engagement was enormous. An entire Soviet division had been stopped by a single sniper. Word of the White Death's incredible marksmanship spread through Soviet ranks, creating fear and uncertainty that affected morale across the entire front. Some Soviet soldiers began refusing to advance in areas where they believed the White Death might be operating. Soviet military leaders realized they were facing something unprecedented. They had never encountered a sniper who was this effective and this elusive. Traditional counter-sniper tactics weren't working because Simo operated differently from conventional military snipers. She used terrain and weather conditions in ways that surprised even experienced Soviet marksmen. A special counter-sniper unit was assembled with one specific mission: eliminate the White Death. This unit consisted of the Soviet Army's best marksmen, equipped with the finest rifles and scopes available. They studied reports of the White Death's activities, trying to identify patterns that might help them predict where she would strike next. The cat-and-mouse game that followed became a battle of wits and skill between some of the world's best snipers. Soviet counter-snipers would position themselves in areas where they expected the White Death to appear, but Simo seemed to anticipate their moves. She would appear in unexpected locations, take her shots, and disappear before the Soviet snipers could respond. One particular duel lasted for 3 days. A Soviet sniper named Kulikov, who was considered one of the Red Army's finest marksmen, had been specifically sent to eliminate Simo. He had studied her methods and believed he understood her patterns. Kulikov positioned himself in what he thought was the perfect location to ambush the White Death when she appeared. Simo knew that Soviet counter-snipers were hunting her specifically, so she spent extra time studying the terrain and looking for signs of enemy snipers. She noticed subtle disturbances in the snow that indicated someone had been moving through the area. Using techniques she had learned while hunting animals, she began tracking the Soviet sniper just as she would track a deer or elk. The confrontation came on the 3rd day when both snipers found themselves in positions where they could see each other's likely hiding spots. It became a waiting game to see who would make the first move and reveal their exact position. For 6 hours, neither sniper moved or fired, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. The decisive moment came when Kulikov adjusted his position slightly to get a better angle on where he thought Simo was hiding. The small movement was enough for Simo to identify his exact location. She had been watching a different area entirely but saw the slight glint of his rifle scope when he moved. One carefully aimed shot ended the duel, and Kulikov became another victim of the White Death. This victory over a specialist sent specifically to kill her enhanced Simo's legendary status even further. Soviet soldiers began to believe that the White Death was supernatural, unable to be killed by conventional means. Some refused to patrol in areas where she had been active, while others carried good luck charms hoping to protect themselves from her deadly accuracy. The international media had begun to take notice of the remarkable stories coming out of the Winter War. Newspapers in America, Britain, and other countries published articles about the mysterious Finnish sniper who was terrorizing the Soviet army. However, most of these articles still assumed that such an effective warrior must be a man. The truth about Simo's identity remained largely unknown outside of Finland. As February 1940 arrived, Simo's confirmed kill count had reached extraordinary numbers. Military historians estimate that she was responsible for over 500 enemy deaths in just 3 months of combat. This number included not only sniper kills but also casualties from small unit actions where she served as a regular infantry soldier when sniping opportunities were not available. What made these numbers even more remarkable was the fact that Simo achieved them while operating in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. Temperatures regularly dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and daylight lasted only a few hours each day. She often had to remain motionless in the snow for 8 to 10 hours at a time, enduring conditions that would incapacitate most people. The physical demands of her role as a sniper were incredible, but the psychological pressure was equally challenging. Every day, Simo knew that hundreds of enemy soldiers were specifically looking for her. One small mistake, one moment of inattention, or one piece of bad luck could mean instant death. The stress of living under this constant threat while maintaining the focus necessary for precision shooting was extraordinary. Despite the pressure, Simo maintained her effectiveness and continued to adapt her tactics as Soviet forces learned to counter her methods. When they began using smoke screens to obscure her vision, she learned to fire through the smoke using sound and movement to identify targets. When they changed their patrol patterns, she studied the new routines and found different ways to exploit them. The support Simo received from her fellow Finnish soldiers was crucial to her success. Other members of her unit would help create diversions, provide intelligence about enemy movements, and protect her escape routes after engagements. They understood that her unique abilities were a valuable asset that needed to be protected and supported. Local Finnish civilians also played a role in supporting Simo's operations. Farmers and hunters who lived in the area would provide information about Soviet movements and help identify the best positions for ambushes. Their intimate knowledge of the local terrain was invaluable in helping Simo stay ahead of the counter-sniper teams that were hunting her. The bond between Simo and the people she was protecting became incredibly strong during this period. She wasn't just fighting for abstract concepts like freedom and independence, she was protecting specific communities, families, and individuals that she knew personally. This personal connection gave her additional motivation and helped her endure the physical and psychological challenges of her role. March 1940 brought both triumph and tragedy to Simo Haiha's extraordinary story. The Winter War was entering its final phase, and, despite being vastly outnumbered, Finnish forces had performed far better than anyone expected. The Soviet Union had suffered massive casualties and international embarrassment, but they were finally beginning to overwhelm Finnish defenses through sheer numbers and resources. On March 6, 1940, Simo was positioned in her usual hunting grounds near the Kala River when a Soviet artillery barrage began. This was not unusual, she had survived dozens of bombardments during her months of combat. However, this particular barrage was different. Soviet forces had been tracking her general area of operations and had concentrated their firepower on locations where she was most likely to be hiding. The explosion that changed everything came without warning. A Soviet artillery shell detonated close enough to Simo's position to cause massive trauma without killing her instantly. Shrapnel from the explosion struck her face, causing devastating injuries that left her unconscious and barely alive. Finnish soldiers who found her hours later were amazed that she had survived such terrible wounds. The injury that ended Simo's combat career was as dramatic and sudden as her rise to legendary status had been. One moment she was the most feared sniper in military history, and the next she was fighting for her life in a military hospital. The same toughness and determination that had made her successful as a sniper now became crucial for her survival as a patient. Medical records from the time show that Simo's injuries were severe enough that doctors initially didn't expect her to live. The shrapnel had caused significant facial damage and affected her ability to see clearly. Even if she survived, it seemed unlikely that she would ever be able to shoot with the precision that had made her famous. For a person whose identity was so closely tied to her marksmanship skills, this was potentially devastating. However, Simo's recovery proved to be as remarkable as her military service had been. She approached healing with the same patience and determination she had shown as a sniper. Slowly, methodically, she worked to regain her strength and adapt to the changes in her vision and coordination. The process took months, but she gradually returned to functionality, though she would never again achieve her previous level of precision shooting. The Winter War officially ended on March 13, 1940, just 1 week after Simo's injury. The peace treaty that ended the conflict required Finland to give up some territory to the Soviet Union, but the country maintained its independence. More importantly, the war had demonstrated that small nations could successfully resist much larger aggressors if they were willing to fight intelligently and courageously. Finland's performance in the Winter War, and stories like Simo's, inspired people around the world who were facing their own struggles against seemingly impossible odds. The idea that ordinary individuals could make extraordinary differences in the face of overwhelming challenges resonated far beyond military circles. Simo had become a symbol of what was possible when determination met opportunity. The final statistics of Simo's military service were staggering by any measure. In approximately 100 days of combat, she had achieved over 500 confirmed kills, making her the most effective sniper in military history. These numbers were even more impressive considering the extreme weather conditions, limited daylight, and intense enemy pressure under which she operated. What made Simo's achievements truly exceptional was not just the numbers, but the impact she had on the overall war effort. Her psychological effect on Soviet forces was immeasurable. Entire units changed their behavior because of fear of the White Death. Attack plans were modified, patrol routes were altered, and morale was affected throughout the Soviet army because of one person's exceptional abilities. Military analysts who studied the Winter War identified Simo's sniper campaign as one of the most effective individual contributions to a war effort in modern history. She had demonstrated that in certain circumstances, one highly skilled and determined person could have strategic impact far beyond what their numbers would suggest. This lesson would influence military thinking for generations to come. After the war ended, Simo's story gradually became known to the international community. The revelation that the feared White Death was actually a small woman from a farming village shocked many people who had assumed such an effective warrior must be a man. Her story challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles in combat and inspired women around the world. The post-war years were a time of adjustment for Simo. Like many veterans, she struggled with the transition from the intense purpose and adrenaline of combat to the quieter rhythms of civilian life. The skills that had made her legendary as a sniper were not easily transferred to peacetime activities. She had to learn how to live without the constant danger and focused purpose that had defined her life during the war. Simo returned to her family's farm in Rotjärvi and attempted to resume the quiet rural life she had known before the war. However, she discovered that it was impossible to completely return to her previous existence. The experiences of the Winter War had changed her profoundly, and the wider world now knew her story. She was no longer just a local hunter, she had become a national hero and international legend. The Finnish government recognized Simo's exceptional service with numerous military decorations and honors. She received the highest awards that Finland could bestow on a military hero, and her story became part of the official history of the Winter War. However, Simo herself remained modest about her achievements and preferred to focus on the collective effort of all Finnish forces rather than her individual accomplishments. As years passed, historians and military experts continued to study Simo's methods and achievements. Her techniques were analyzed in military academies around the world, and her story was included in training programs for special forces units. The tactical innovations she had developed during the Winter War influenced sniper training and guerrilla warfare doctrine for decades. The psychological aspects of Simo's success were as important as her technical skills. Military psychologists studied how she had managed to maintain focus and effectiveness under extreme stress for extended periods. Her ability to remain calm and patient while knowing that hundreds of enemies were actively hunting her was considered exceptional even by the standards of elite military personnel. International recognition of Simo's achievements grew slowly but steadily in the post-war years. Military historians from various countries visited Finland to interview her and study the battlefield locations where she had operated. Her story was included in books about remarkable military achievements and unusual heroes of World War II-era conflicts. The impact of Simo's story extended beyond military circles. She became an inspiration for people facing their own seemingly impossible challenges. Her example showed that ordinary individuals could achieve extraordinary things when they combined natural talent with determination, careful preparation, and absolute commitment to their goals. Women's rights advocates pointed to Simo's story as evidence that women could excel in roles traditionally reserved for men. Her achievements had been based on skill, intelligence, and determination rather than physical strength or aggressive behavior. She had succeeded by being better at the technical and psychological aspects of warfare rather than trying to match male stereotypes of military behavior. Environmental and outdoor education programs used Simo's story to demonstrate the importance of understanding and respecting natural environments. Her intimate knowledge of forest terrain, weather patterns, and animal behavior had been crucial to her military success. She represented a connection between traditional outdoor skills and modern challenges. The long-term legacy of the White Death extended far beyond her immediate military achievements. She had demonstrated that individuals could make enormous differences when they applied their unique talents to important causes. Her story inspired people to develop their own abilities and to be ready to use them when circumstances demanded extraordinary efforts. Simo's influence on military doctrine was substantial and lasting. Her methods were studied and incorporated into sniper training programs worldwide. The psychological warfare aspects of her campaign influenced thinking about how individual specialists could affect large-scale military operations. Her example showed that unconventional approaches could be more effective than traditional military tactics. The story of the White Death also became part of Finland's national identity and cultural heritage. Simo represented the determination and resourcefulness that had allowed a small nation to maintain its independence against overwhelming odds. Her legacy reminded future generations of Finns that they had the capability to defend their freedom if circumstances ever again required such sacrifice. As Simo aged, she remained connected to her rural roots and continued to live simply despite her fame. She participated in veterans organizations and occasionally spoke about her wartime experiences, but she never sought publicity or tried to capitalize on her legendary status. She preferred to be remembered as someone who had done her duty when her country needed her rather than as a celebrity or hero. The final chapter of Simo's life was as remarkable as her military service had been. She lived to be 96 years old, passing away in 2002 after witnessing tremendous changes in the world she had helped to protect. Her longevity allowed her to see the end of the Cold War, the development of modern Finland as a prosperous democratic nation, and the recognition of her achievements by new generations who learned about her story. Today, the legacy of the White Death continues to inspire people around the world. Her story has been told in books, documentaries, and films that introduce new audiences to her remarkable achievements. Military museums display exhibits about her techniques and equipment, and visitors to Finland can tour the areas where she operated during the Winter War. The ultimate lesson of Simo Häyhä's story is not just about military prowess or marksmanship skills. It is about the potential that exists within ordinary people when they are faced with extraordinary circumstances. She proved that heroes are not born, they are created when normal individuals rise to meet challenges that demand the very best of human capabilities. Her legend reminds us that in the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, one person with courage and determination can change the course of history.